I've spent years at the bedsides of people taking their last breaths, and after seeing it hundreds of times, you start to recognize a certain rhythm. The way the breathing changes and the skin cools down becomes almost predictable, like a clock winding down its final seconds. But there is one specific shift that still makes me stop every single time. It doesn't feel like it belongs to the body alone, and it is the one thing that still truly haunts me. I've watched patients who were unresponsive for days suddenly fall into a deep, immediate calm that defies medical logic. People who hadn't whispered a word in hours might suddenly open their eyes and speak with a clarity that shouldn't be possible. Most families see this and think it's a miracle recovery, believing their loved one is finally coming back to stay. But as a nurse, I've learned that this sudden surge of life is actually a sign of something much more mysterious. I remember one woman who hadn't reacted to anything for over 24 hours, just drifting in that silent space. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, she called every family member in the room by their name. She looked at each of them with total peace and simply said, "Now, everything is okay." The room went silent as the family froze between hope and confusion. They didn't know if she was really back or if this was just a final, haunting trick of the mind. In those seconds, the entire atmosphere of the room shifts from heavy grief to an almost frantic sense of hope. You can see it in the daughter's eyes as she leans in, whispering, "Mom, are you really here?" Medical monitors are showing heart rates dropping and oxygen levels failing. Yet here she is, looking more present than she has in weeks. It's a paradox that makes everyone in the room hold their breath, wondering if they are witnessing a medical miracle or something far more unsettling. As a nurse, you stand there in the corner, caught between the family's joy and the clinical reality you know is coming. You start to ask yourself how a brain that hasn't received proper oxygen for hours can suddenly coordinate memory, speech, and emotion with such precision. It feels like a glitch in the natural order of things, a sudden spark from a candle that should have already gone out. Is the body fighting to stay, or is the mind preparing for something we can't see? This phenomenon is so common, it has a name in the hospice world, but even that name doesn't begin to explain the deeper mystery of why it happens. It's as if the person is being handed a temporary key to unlock their own consciousness one last time before the door closes forever. But what if this isn't just a random surge of electricity? What if this clarity is actually a deliberate part of the transition process that we've been misinterpreting for decades? The physical process often begins with a shift in the breath that is impossible to ignore. It isn't just that it slows down. It becomes irregular, with long, heavy pauses that make everyone in the room lean in, wondering if that was the final one. You might notice their hands and feet becoming cool to the touch, often turning a faint, marbled purple as the heart focuses its remaining energy on the core. But while the body is visibly shutting down, there is often a strange, intense focus in the eyes that doesn't match the physical decline. Many patients who have been completely unresponsive will suddenly begin to reach out into the empty air, their fingers grasping at something we simply cannot see. They might start whispering to people who aren't in the room, or their eyes will fixate on a corner of the ceiling with a look of profound recognition. To an outsider, it looks like terminal agitation or a brain failing, but there is a strange intentionality to these movements. It's as if they are navigating a different environment entirely, one that is slowly overlapping with our own. This is where the medical reality and the human experience truly start to collide. We see the oxygen levels dropping on the monitor, which usually causes panic and distress, but the patient often looks like they've never been more at peace. They aren't struggling, they are transitioning, and that distinction is something most people don't realize until they are standing right there. It makes you wonder, if the body is truly failing, why does the person inside it suddenly seem so incredibly occupied with something we can't perceive? When families witness the irregular gasping or the sudden restlessness, their first instinct is almost always to panic. They see the chest heaving and assume their loved one is desperately fighting for every ounce of air, or they see a twitch and believe it's a signal of deep, unmanaged pain. It's heartbreaking to watch because we project our own terror of suffering onto them in those final hours. We assume that because it looks difficult for us to see, it must be agonizing for them to experience, but that is rarely the case. The reality, however, is much more startling and often brings a sense of profound relief once you understand the mechanics of it. Most of those struggling sounds are actually just the body's autopilot taking over. a rhythmic reflex that happens long after the conscious mind has drifted away. It isn't a battle, it's a mechanical shutting down. What looks like a crisis is often just the physical shell finishing its final tasks, while the person inside has already moved beyond the reach of pain. It's peace, disguised as a struggle. But this leads to a question that even seasoned medical professionals struggle to answer. If the body is just a machine winding down, why do some patients suddenly break through that autopilot state with a moment of perfect, crystalline awareness? It's as if they are momentarily pulled back from a vast distance just to say one last thing or share one final look of recognition. It makes you realize that what we perceive as the end of the story is often just the beginning of a much deeper transition. And that is the part that changes everything. Have you ever noticed how an old grandfather clock sounds when it's finally running out of tension? The breathing follows a similar, predictable path that often terrifies families, but to us, it's just a familiar sequence. It starts with those long, deep breaths, followed by heavy silence, sometimes for 30 seconds, or even a full minute. While it looks like the person is desperately gasping for air, they are actually drifting into a state where the body no longer feels the need to fight. It's a rhythmic letting go, not a struggle. As the breathing slows, you'll start to see the circulation change in a way that looks like a map of a journey ending. The blood begins to prioritize the heart, leaving the hands and feet to grow cold and take on a marbled, purple pattern. Most people see this and think their loved one is freezing, but they aren't shivering or in any distress. Their internal system is simply shifting its focus, pulling all the remaining warmth into the core to protect the spark of life for just a few more moments. But the most confusing part of this pattern is the way the mind fluctuates between being completely gone and suddenly present. A patient might spend hours in a state that looks like a heavy, unreachable sleep, only to suddenly seem light or aware for a few seconds. It's not a random glitch or a sign of pain. It's a standard part of how the consciousness detaches from the physical frame. This ebb and flow of awareness is a clear signal that the transition is reaching its final, most mysterious stage. When you look at these signs together, the breath, the skin, and the awareness, you realize it isn't a chaotic failure at all. It's a highly organized, biological unplugging that happens in almost the exact same way for everyone, regardless of their illness. It's as if there is a hidden, universal blueprint for leaving that the body follows to ensure the exit is as gentle as possible. But if this is all just simple biology, why does it so often feel like they are looking at someone we can't see? The woman I mentioned earlier had been in a deep, unresponsive state for nearly 48 hours, her breath barely a whisper. Her children were gathered around the bed, tired and heavy with the kind of grief that only comes after days of waiting for the end. The room felt thick, almost stagnant, with only the soft hum of the oxygen concentrator cutting through the silence. There was no medical reason to believe she would ever open her eyes again, or recognize a single face in that room. Then, without any warning, her breathing hitched, and she sat up slightly, her eyes wide and filled with an incredible, piercing light. She didn't just wake up. She returned with a presence that felt stronger than it had been in years. She looked at her son, then her daughters, calling them each by name with a voice that was steady and clear. The family gasped, frozen in a state of shock, convinced that the disease had somehow retreated and left her whole again. But it was what she did next that truly stayed with me and changed how the family saw that moment. Instead of looking only at the people standing right in front of her, her gaze drifted to a corner of the room that was completely empty. A gentle smile spread across her face, and she began to nod as if listening to a conversation we couldn't hear. She wasn't confused or scared. She looked like someone who had just seen an old friend waiting at the door. In that instant, the family's frantic hope for a recovery transformed into a quiet, sacred understanding of what was actually happening. They realized she wasn't coming back to stay with them. She was being given a bridge to cross over with dignity. What they first perceived as a miracle of healing was actually a miracle of transition, a final gift of clarity before the light faded. It was the most peaceful moment I have ever witnessed, proving that the end isn't always a dark descent. We have spent so long being taught to fear the physical signs of the end, the heavy breathing, the stillness, and that specific sound we often call the death rattle. It sounds like a struggle, and it's often the thing that haunts family members the most. But when you stand where I stand, you start to see it through a different lens. It isn't a battle for life. It's a rhythmic, mechanical release. The person you love is simply finishing their work here, drifting into a space where fear no longer exists. That final surge of clarity isn't a cruel trick or a random spark of electricity in a failing brain. It's a purposeful moment of connection, a bridge built so that no one has to leave in the dark. We spend our lives terrified of this transition, but what I've witnessed suggests the exit is far more organized and gentle than we ever dared to imagine. It's as if the body knows exactly how to step aside so that something deeper can find its way home with perfect, silent grace. I have watched the fear vanish from 1,000 faces in their final seconds, replaced by a look of profound recognition and rest. It is the most quiet, sacred transition a human being can make. If this journey has helped you see that light a bit more clearly, I invite you to share your heart and your stories with us here. We are all walking each other home, and I look forward to continuing this path with you in the next video.